Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Governor's Summit on Early Language and Literacy session on Language as a Missing Link and Missed Opportunity. I am Wendy Lumley, a literacy consultant working with the Deal Center.
And I am Kim Scott, the Administrative Office Manager with the Deal Center, and we will be assisting our presenters for today's session.
A few housekeeping items to keep in mind before we get started. We encourage you to use the chat box to ask questions or share comments. We will hold questions for the presenters until the end of the session for discussion during the Q&A. We'll also drop any links shared during the presentation in the chat box. Participant handouts for this presentation will be available after the session. Please direct all technical questions to the chat box drop-down menu, and we will respond as quickly as possible. Also, this session is being recorded, so please remain muted throughout the presentation. It is now my pleasure to introduce our presenters, Dr. Gary McGibney and Ariane Weldon. Dr. Gary McGibney is the Executive Director of Government and Education Programs for ShareCare and former Deputy State School Superintendent. He has over 30 years of experience as a school psychologist and administrator in public education. Ariane Weldon is the Strategic Innovation Manager and Get Georgia Reading Campaign Director for Georgia Family Connection Partnership. Her work includes connecting decision makers across Georgia to create the conditions essential for all children to succeed. Kim, please stop sharing your screen so the presenters may begin, and welcome Dr. McGibney and Ms. Weldon.
Gary, you need to unmute.
Today, we're going to talk about something that's only recently emerging as a topic essential to our children and to people that interact and support children and teenagers. Before we get into the details, it's important to put this into context, and that context is how systems work. Because what we'll discuss today is a new concept and a new awareness that may challenge some existing systems. Have you ever been frustrated with a system? I'm sure you have, and you have probably also experienced how difficult it is to navigate a system and how hard it is to change a system. That's why this quote resonates, because if we cannot change a system, maybe it's up to us to create a new system that makes the current system obsolete. But how and why do we need to do that? Let me illustrate by beginning with the next slide. Most of us live in the remedy system. Why? Because we're extremely busy with a long list of things to do. That's why it's important to look at this slide for a moment, because the distinction between a remedy and a solution is really important in today's presentation. What happens if we are remedy focused? Well, this means we are interested in the problem, of course, but we are responding to the presenting problem instead of looking for the basic problem, because we are task-driven instead of purpose-driven. Do you remember the best-selling book a few years ago titled The Purpose-Driven Life? You know, that book that was on the bestseller list for years, the one that everybody claims they read. Yes, that one. If you read the book, do you remember the first sentence in the book? The first sentence in The Purpose-Driven Life, a book that everyone really needs to read, is this: it's not about you. But when you're remedy focused, it really is about you. Even if your intentions are good and you're noble and your heart is in the right place, in the remedy system, we chase problems and search for remedies so we can move on to something else because we're all busy. But what happens when we stay in the remedy system where we address just the presenting problem? That's right. You knew the answer before we showed it, right? The problems come back to you time and time and time again. The problems come back because the basic problem has not been addressed. Two things happen when you chase problems in the remedy system. One, you never catch the problem. And number two, the chase wears you down physically and emotionally. It burns you out. And I know at this point, I think I know what you're thinking. You're saying to yourself, well, Gary, if the remedy system is so bad, why do we stay in the remedy system? Well, it's simply because sometimes it works. Sometimes it gets a problem out of the way, and we think it works. It gets us through the day. It allows us to move to the next problem. But the problem will keep coming back to you in some shape or some form until you find the basic problem. Today, we're going to focus on a basic problem that too often is part of the remedy system, and we will illustrate how seeking the basic problem can create a new system, a system based on solutions that can change the lives of children and teenagers that we work and support. A basic problem that receives very little attention, if any attention, is the importance of language skills, the missing link and missed opportunities. We want you to know that a significant number of children and teenagers, the research shows, cannot express or channel their frustrations or even express their needs and understand what's going on around them because they do not have the necessary and fundamental language skills. So some of them act out or withdraw as a form of communications. In other words, when children don't have language, their behavior becomes their language. That statement represents a different perspective that should move us to look for solutions. Ariane will talk about a common view of the existing system.
Does this look familiar to anybody? Have you ever had anything like this in front of you? So 17-year-old high school dropout. That's the story on this kid, right? Everything that's in this file folder represents the story. A file folder full of likely remedies, not very likely solutions. Well, we know those numbers and files can't really talk, but what if they could? What if those numbers and files told us a story? What if they told us we got the story wrong and that our remedy is not a solution? So the natural next question would be, how do we move from remedies to solutions? So we suggest taking a look at the system from an epidemiological perspective. Now, I want to keep this very simple. You're not really here for a course in epidemiology, but do listen up because you're going to have a little bit of a pop quiz and about halfway through the presentation. So listen up. There's two basic things we want you to know. Two basic things about epidemiology. That for diseases, number one, they don't occur by chance. There are always factors that influence a disease to occur. We may not know what all those factors are, but we know they don't occur by chance. And two, they're not random. There are patterns of factors, and that provides clues to inform solutions. Now, what's interesting is you can say the same is true for behavior problems. You could say the same is true for literacy. You could say the same is true for a number of things, that these things don't occur by chance. Behavior problems, literacy, they don't occur by chance. There are always factors that influence a behavior problem to occur. There are always factors that influence literacy to occur. You can fill in the blank. And they're not random. There are patterns of factors, and that illuminates clues to inform solutions. In other words, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. The ability to communicate is fundamental to the social, emotional, and academic success of children and teens. Indeed, communicative exchanges are the fuel for brain development and the development of language skills. So engagement is the key. Language skills are the vehicle for frequent and positive social connections with caregivers, educators, and peers, and non-negotiable for education attainment, mental and physical health and well-being, and positive quality of life. Now, before we go any further, there's a really important distinction because semantics matter. Speech versus language. So oftentimes you might see something about like speech language or speech language therapy or speech, and we really don't take a moment to think about, is there a distinction and would that distinction be important? Well, there's a really big distinction and it's a very important one. So first is speech is about producing sounds accurately. So a couple of things you're probably familiar with or might have heard of: articulation and fluency. So those are, the process by which we make speech sounds, fluency, the continuity, smoothness, and rate. Now, keep in mind, these are not underlying. These are not hidden, right? So if you're noticing an issue, it's pretty much right above board. It's a presenting issue. Remember, you heard earlier about presenting in basic. So these present themselves pretty clearly. Language deals with meaning and connection with others. So when we're referring to language, I want to make sure you know we're talking about, in general, expressive language, receptive language, and pragmatic language. So just want to make sure we're going to come back to these three, but when we talk about language, those three basic skills. So what's the issue? The prevalence: at least 12% of kids who enter school have language difficulties that hinder their social development and educational progress. And we know, and the research shows, that this significantly predicts problems with behavioral, mental health, and academic outcomes. It's important to know that. But why does this matter?
Look at this quote: "If all my possessions were taken from me with one exception, I would choose to keep the power of communication, for by it I would soon again regain all the rest." What a powerful testament to the power of language ability. It's important to understand that the effective use of language skills is linked to increased student engagement and decreased aggressive behavior. Research also shows that children and teenagers who have language difficulties are much more likely to experience peer rejection, are more likely to be bullied, and are subject to feelings of anger, sometimes overwhelming anger, that they may turn toward others or themselves. In fact, anger may be the symptom or the presenting problem that indicates language difficulties exist, which could be the basic problem. But too often we respond to the anger, the problem that's in front of us, which we cannot, of course, ignore, but the consequence and our reaction to their behavior may take us down the wrong path with the child or adolescent, which means we may be missing an opportunity to find a solution. We need to remember this: language difficulties are the most frequent developmental issue among children and teenagers, according to a growing body of research, yet language skills are seldom considered when we respond to the behavior and other problems of children and teenagers. So what are some early clues and impacts of language development?
Language development starts early. Abundant, positive, language-rich social interactions between a baby and their caregiver are the fuel for the development of language skills. This description, abundant, positive, language-rich social interactions, is really what we call language nutrition. Language development has predictable sequences. Although individual differences exist, by age 2, most children know about 50 words and combine them in short phrases. By kindergarten, they will demonstrate greater self-regulation and academic skills and fewer externalizing and internalizing problem behaviors. Now notice this, the link between language skills directly impacting self-regulation. It's an important thing to notice. Research shows that one of the most powerful predictors of third grade literacy and math is a child's language skill at age 5. And by the end of elementary school, only 15% of kids with language difficulties achieve the expected level in reading, compared to 61% of their peers without language difficulties. This continues into adulthood. Children with language difficulties at age 5 are 4 times more likely to have reading problems in adolescence and adulthood, 3 times more likely to have mental health disorders, and twice as likely to be unemployed. But what do language difficulties look like?
Let's first consider what language difficulties look like, as Ariane said earlier, and Ariane earlier mentioned receptive, expressive, and pragmatic language. So let's go into more depth with each of those. Regarding expressive language difficulties, this includes children and teenagers who have limited vocabulary compared to their peers. And you can see, as we noted earlier, why they would be more likely to experience peer rejection and become very frustrated because they leave out words when talking. They use tenses incorrectly and even struggle oftentimes to put words together correctly. So they use choppy sentences or incomplete sentences, which hampers their social interactions. And even simple conversations can be negatively impacted. Regarding receptive language difficulties, this is when children and teenagers struggle to understand what's being communicated to them and therefore have problems following instructions or directions. They have problems understanding what's being conveyed in a group of students and even what's expected of them. As an example, when you're talking to them, they may look at you with a blank expression, which itself can be misinterpreted as them having an attitude or not paying attention. If we say something to our child or a grandchild or a teenager we're working with, and they just give us a blank stare without saying a word, what's our typical reaction? Sometimes it goes like this: "Are you listening to me?" And typically we say that with a much more elevated voice. Children and teenagers with receptive language issues may also have problems organizing their thoughts and sometimes act out or withdraw when their social environment becomes just too difficult for them to understand. It's just too confusing and overwhelming for them. Let me put it this way. Have you ever been in a situation where there's so much noise and so much activity going on around you that you just want to shout for everybody to stop and to be quiet? Well, that's how children and teenagers feel that have language difficulty. When children and teens have issues with pragmatic language, they have a limited ability to read social situations, decipher social cues, or understand body language, or conform to unspoken rules or social engagement, such as any type of social interactions. They have difficulty answering questions and initiating and maintaining conversations. They make inappropriate and off-topic comments. They have narrative difficulties, and these are all increased during stressful times and when children and adolescents are in unfamiliar or complex social situations. But now you're probably thinking about some of the children and teenagers you work with that fit these descriptions. As we mentioned earlier, the presence of behavior problems, social problems, and our learning problems can distract us from considering the existence of language difficulties. When this happens, we assign cause to the behavior, what we think is causing the behavior, or we label the behavior and react to that instead of trying to determine the basic problem or the cause of the behavior. And let me explain how and why that occurs. How we characterize and label behavior has more to do with attribution than anything else. And if I ask you if you've heard of the word attribution, most of you would shake your head no. I once asked an audience of over 1,500 people to raise their hands if they had heard of the word attribution, and only one hand went up. And that's because he misunderstood the question. It amazes me that we don't talk more about attribution, because attribution impacts all of us every day of our lives because it drives many of our decisions. What is attribution? Attribution is this: our response to some behavior has more to do with why we think they did what they did instead of what they actually did. I know some of you are looking at your computer monitor right now with a quizzical look, saying to yourself, what did he just say? So let me repeat it. Our response to someone's behavior has more to do with why we think they did it than what they actually did. That's why we're so inconsistent with things like discipline. And we're even inconsistent with how we discipline our own children, because we're responding to the attribution, why we think they did what they did, more so than what they did. So, okay, what happens when we attribute the wrong cause to the behavior? This is an important question. What happens when we make that error? This is what research has found to be and is called the fundamental attribution error, which is important. After we discover the cause for the behavior, we then characterize the behavior. And here's where it gets seriously flawed. What if we pick the wrong cause and mischaracterize the behavior? So consider this. Let's try to stop characterizing behavior and get better at describing behavior, because therein we'll find solutions. And this is why. And let's be honest, when we attribute the behavior of children and teens to laziness, do we give them extra help? Not likely. We should ask this: does he or she have the language skills to request help? When we attribute the behavior of children and teens to a lack of concern or interest, do we offer more information or try to explain more? Not likely. What we should do is make sure they receive an explanation using words they understand. And this is kind of a big one here. When we attribute the behavior of children and teens to an attitude, are we interested in giving them a chance to tell their side of the story? Not likely. What we should do is find out if they have the language skills to understand what we are saying to them and for them to express their thoughts and feelings. Too often, ladies and gentlemen, when we think children and teenagers are lazy or don't care or have an attitude, we're done with them. But what if we're wrong? It is possible that we're mischaracterizing the language difficulties as inattention, defiance, cognitive problems, anger, or lack of willingness to engage. Let me say here that this is not about making excuses for behavior. Now, this is being purpose-driven to finding solutions by taking a closer look at behavior and considering what we haven't considered before. And what's wrong with taking a closer look? Is it possible that language skills are that missing link? Are we so quick to judge and so quick to react that we can't take the time to consider other possibilities for the behavior? And consider this: it can help if we reconceptualize behavior as a form of language. If we take the opportunity to understand what the behavior may be telling us and take into account the situation, the behavior of others, and even our own behavior, we might be able to shed light on the basic problem. Remember what Ariane said earlier, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Perhaps language can go from being a missing link to becoming a guiding light. So here's another very important question for us. How are language skills linked to mental health?
So as we get into this part of the presentation, I just want to start off with a quick definition. So again, semantics are important. So what do we describe as child and adolescent mental health? Well, according to the CDC, mental health for children and teens is defined as these three basic things: the ability to, 1, reach developmental and emotional milestones; 2, learn and demonstrate healthy social skills; and 3, cope with problems. Now, typically, if I ask, what do we think about when we think about mental health for children and teens? Most people will actually jump to what it's not, which is mental illness. They will skip over what I'm just talking about as just what is mental health? What does that refer to? And again, those distinctions are important. Although often not apparent, language skills are a significant contributing factor to the prevention of emotional and mental health problems throughout childhood and the teen years. It's the difference between a presenting problem and a basic problem. Indeed, research shows, and this is recent research, language skills have a demonstrated protective effect on the mental health of children and teens, as the ability to share and cope with emotions relies on inner language. Now think about having an inner language. And do you ever realize that you probably use inner language throughout your day? Do you ever wake up in the morning and you've got such a long to-do list that you just, even if you don't write down physically what's on your list, you kind of go through in your head and you begin to just calm down a little bit. You sort of self-regulate. And you rely on those skills all the time for decision making. Imagine not having that skill. Imagine not having inner language. In contrast, the failure to develop a capacity for effective communication often leads to inattention, hyperactivity, self-regulation problems, and jeopardizes emotional and mental health and well-being. Indeed, we often pathologize behavior. Now, it's hard to see folks in the room here today, but oftentimes when we're presenting, when I say that term, a lot of times I see a lot of heads nod, just in terms of, oh yeah. I mean, and I think a lot of times people can't help it. Even people who wouldn't really be trained to be able to pathologize anything. Identification of language difficulties is complicated by the fact they're often quickly misinterpreted, characterized, and labeled. So this is another important distinction, a label versus a description. Here's an example. ADHD, ODD, conduct disorder. These share similar characteristics with language difficulties. These are sort of typical, extremely, when you look at what are the highly prevalent mental health issues, mental health disorders that are diagnosed, whether or not all of them are actually the case, those are among the most among young children. Now here's a description. So on the left is a label, on the right is a description. Difficulty listening when spoken to, problems following instructions, talking excessively, blurting out answers, interrupting, not waiting for turns in conversations. So on the right, you see descriptions, and that's really characteristics of language difficulties. So on the left, you see a presenting problem. Does the label help a lot, or does that take you to a remedy? Where the basic problem, the description, can you get towards a solution? Nothing works. I know something's wrong, but I just can't put my finger on it. Have you ever said that, or you heard someone say that, or worked with people who said that? Now, it may not always be the case, but consider, and sometimes, is it language? Now, I really talked a lot about inner language before because it's so important. It's so important to our mental health and well-being and our everyday coping, just getting through day to day. Language skills provide one's inner dialogue. So now keep in mind that having language skills actually provides you with your inner dialogue. And though that inner dialogue is required to effectively reason, comprehend, self-regulate, and cope with the demands of everyday life. Children and teens with strong inner dialogue skills are more likely to self-regulate, cope with problems, and are better protected, in fact, against the development of depression. That's recent research. It's pretty powerful to see. And what I really like to say, especially if several of you, I'm guessing, are teachers, I love to say, did you know that what you're doing is making an even bigger difference than you might not even realize? I think you already know literacy and quality of life go hand in hand. Did you know that it's also developing, protective factors for mental health development, a protective factor against the development of depression? Feel confident, feel even stronger about what you do, because you're making an even bigger difference than you might not have even realized. Children and teens with language difficulties struggle with inner dialogue and are less likely to reason, understand others, self-regulate, and cope with problems. And again, that puts them at a little bit of a less of a protective factor against some of those issues. But what does this mean?
Well, operating at the surface level, in other words, at the remedy level, when instead the situation requires a deeper understanding of a child's emotional state, can result in a child or teenager being judged as selfish or uncaring. So instead, consider the possibility of language difficulties and how they can impact our responses and interventions. A basic problem, not just a presenting problem. For example, talk-based therapy for children and teens is often based on the assumption that their language represents their thoughts and feelings, that the child or teen has the language skills necessary to express themselves. For children and teens with language difficulties, this can create a situation that can be confusing, stressful, and even frustrating to them. This is one of the many reasons why language is so important, because understanding the language skills of children and teens will not only influence the diagnostic process, it will also help determine the most appropriate and thoughtful response. Consider this example from a case study of what can be done when we consider language. A 10-year-old boy was referred to a diagnosis of psychosis based on his very peculiar responses during testing, very unusual responses. During therapy sessions, he was extremely active and talkative. Questioning and problem-solving approaches often led to inappropriate, very peculiar verbal responses. A brief language screening indicated the likelihood of receptive language difficulties when the therapist enhanced opportunities for engagement in therapy by adding visual cues such as pictures and drawings. The child's activity level decreased and he was able to work with the therapist. He was able to draw pictures of the problem situation, which he was being teased a lot, and then draw alternative ways of dealing with frustration and anger. In another case study, a 5-year-old student had terrible temper tantrums every time the teacher instructed the students to move from one activity to another. I'm talking about on the floor, kicking and screaming type of temper tantrums. The teacher, because of her training and awareness of language, noticed that the student did not appear to understand the instructions. The teacher thought the student did not understand the concept of transition and the instructions related to transitioning. Therefore, she gave the student a stuffed animal as a link to understand the concept of transition. And guess what happened? The temper tantrum ceased. This stopped really what could have been a trajectory toward out-of-school suspensions and falling hopelessly behind academically. Changed the whole trajectory of that child's life. Now, Orianne will tell you the dot story.
So this is another, these are all true stories here. This is one that happened in Georgia, in sort of the middle Georgia area. And it was a few years ago, and it was during in-person school. And it was the beginning of the school year. And it was in a kindergarten classroom. So a kindergarten classroom teacher had called the administrative office where the multi-tiered system of supports director and coordinator was working and said, I have a child whose behavior is out of control. And, I just can't do anything about it. And so that individual from the office went and was standing outside the doorway. This individual also had about 20, 25 years of experience in language and literacy development, and also understood a lot of that. So what they observed was that the teacher had all of the students, this is the beginning of kindergarten, and they were working on worksheets, working on numbers. Now, speaking of kindergarten and working on worksheets, that's a whole nother thing for another day. But so the students were instructed to draw a line and then a dot. So put a line and then the dot in the tens frame. And the little boy had drawn a line, and then every time she'd say, now a dot, and he wrote another line. And she said, I said a dot, and he proceeded to draw another line. And this got louder and louder, and this individual from the central office went in and asked the teacher, may I? And the teacher walked off. And that person from the central office, what do you think they asked the little boy? They asked the little boy a question. And you're probably guessing that, and I bet somebody's going to write that in the chat, but I'm going to say it, and I know you're already thinking it. Do you know what a dot is? The little boy had no idea what the dot was. Exactly, thank you. No idea what a dot was, and shouldn't be expected to. And so they took the opportunity to model. They did it together. The little boy did it on his own, did the typical I do, we do, you do, and from then on kind of kept their eye on this little boy throughout the year. But that's another example where things that can be completely misconstrued. And how are language skills linked with child welfare? I think we're showing you the context of where Language is a link across so many areas of life and all of our collective work. Children and teens who experience trauma are often literally out of touch with their feelings and frequently have no language to describe their internal states. Remember, inner language. I'm saying that over and over. The lack of inner language constrains a child's ability to reason effectively, regulate emotions, and cope with problems. In the child welfare world, we actually know from research that children and teens who have experienced abuse and neglect are 3 to 6 times more likely to have language difficulties than their non-maltreated peers. It's interesting. The research also shows these difficulties are particularly frequent in the areas of expression, that's expressive language, and the social use of language, that's pragmatic language. Now, think about this first bullet for a second. If you have a little bit of receptive language, so you have kind of a little bit of a basic understanding of what's happening, but you have a really hard time with expressing and understanding cues around you, that can be one of the most tragic situations because of what's happening internally and the inability to engage. So again, we're going to continue to talk about engagement. You're going to hear more of that. As a result, this can limit their use of language to communicating basic needs, rather than for social or emotional reasons, such as thoughts and feelings. Recent research comparing the pragmatic language, remember that social communication, of 42-month-old neglected children to their same age peers found that 44% of neglected children had pragmatic language difficulties compared to only 4% of non-neglected, and these are 3.5-year-old children. That's 11 times the rate. A review of studies examining maltreated school-age children and teens found that 86% had significant language difficulties. And this may seem controversial, but it's an important point that one of the researchers shared was that children and teens in foster care who are in talk-based behavior therapy and case planning are effectively in a second language environment if there is a difficulty that has not been considered with their language skills. Indeed, children and teens in foster care who have language skills are more likely to experience problems with resilience and well-being, challenging behavior, and often what is about 80 to 85% of the response, which is behavioral and mental health interventions, problems with behavioral and mental health interventions. Indeed, children and teens in foster care with language difficulties have longer stays in care than their peers. Take into account child A's story. Prior to her present placement, a 15-year-old girl had 20 previous placement breakdowns and a history of aggressive and verbal and physical behavior. She had previously been identified as having no obvious difficulties with her ability to communicate, but that she would communicate emotion by her behavior. Now, you all know enough to know that those two things don't go well together when you say they have no difficulties with the ability to communicate, but they would communicate emotion by behavior. Following staff concern about her communication skills, a language screening was completed and indicated a likelihood of difficulties, especially with expressive and pragmatic language. The results were used to inform her foster parents, case managers, teachers, therapists, and the court staff about opportunities to enhance their practice and their environments to foster child A's engagement at home, in school, during therapy, and in the courtroom. Now, keep in mind, this was not, let's do a screening to refer to services. In this case, and I have to say, this is an example that happened in the UK, not yet in the United States, but we're beginning to do some of that work in Georgia, that this was actually, how do we address our practices? How do we address our systems? How do we address our practice and policy? So it's not about something's wrong with the child and let's go fix the thing wrong with the child. Let's create the system, the new system that makes the existing system obsolete, right? As a result of enhancing opportunities to foster investment independence, and initiation in all settings, her communication, social skills, and behavior improved significantly. This can happen whether we're talking about a teenager or an infant. Her case manager said, "What I have experienced is her improved confidence in expressing herself, listening, and understanding. This has been an invaluable part of the progress she has made in placement and has allowed her greater opportunities to make meaningful relationships with adults and peers alike." That's quality of life. And how are language skills linked with juvenile justice?
Internationally known researchers Hopkins and Snow found that children and teens involved with juvenile justice are, look at that, 5 times more likely than their non-offending peers to have language difficulties. However, they typically are not given a language screening. And let's give another practical example of what that might mean. Many schools and courts are implementing restorative practice, which has been proven through research to be very effective. There are situations where it's not as effective. And typically a school principal or juvenile court judge wants to know how the child or teen responded in the restorative practice sessions. Did they engage? Did they seem interested? Did they show any remorse for what they had done? Look what the report may sound or look like if the child or teen has expressive and or receptive language difficulty. You may hear comments like, "Well, the only thing we heard from the student was, yep, no, don't know, maybe. He wasn't engaged. He didn't seem to care." With the receptive language difficulties, the child may appear to understand what's being said, may even nod in agreement, but he's missing important nuances during the session and perhaps lacks the language skills to be able to engage fully in the restorative practice session. As we were doing this research, we found another very interesting and we think a relevant discovery about language skills. And that is the expression of remorse is very complex and requires substantially developed language skills. The words must be appropriate, of course, but the delivery, the tone of voice, and the facial expression must also match what is being said. I mean, how many times have we heard this about a child or a teenager? He showed no remorse for what he did. And that attribution can lead to a response or a consequence that only makes the situation worse. In other words, it does not lead to a solution. So today we've encouraged purpose-driven efforts to find solutions and create a new system if necessary. So let's talk about what can be done.
So this part of the presentation, this quote really reflects many opportunities. When a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. So let's just start with first that language is a well-being indicator. It's the same as oral health, vision, hearing. Expand use of strategies and routine well child visits that provide families with guidance about noticing language skills and how to enhance their development. And that is something we talk about with language nutrition coaching. But what is language nutrition? Again, a reminder, it's very simple. Language nutrition refers to abundant, positive, language-rich social interactions with caregivers, educators, and peers. Provide language nutrition coaching training for pre-service and in-service nurses to mentor parents during their interactions with expecting new parents to strengthen caregiver efficacy, to engage in frequent positive language-rich social interactions with their babies. Provide mentorship with parents, caregivers, and all who interact with children and teens to strengthen efficacy, again, with those interactions. In an attempt to use language as a beacon or a guiding light to improve education outcomes, mental health and well-being, and quality of life for all children and teens, Opportunities exist for individuals, practitioners, and policymakers to integrate the following practices in everyday settings. Number one, train everyone to notice indicators of language in children and teens. We're talking about from birth all the way up through high school. Now, notice here, we aren't saying notice problems. We're saying notice indicators of language skills. And you see up here, we have developed a tool called the Language Skills by Age Band. It's just simply a nice reference tool, and that will be provided for you and uploaded after the session. Number two, monitor engagement as a gauge of language skill development. So we have something that many of you may be familiar with. It's called the SEEKS Social Engagement Ladder. Again, these are both free tools, very simple. And indeed, research shows, and we know, engagement is actually a gauge of language development. Next, if engagement levels of specific children or teens are low on multiple occasions, so we're not saying everybody, but on multiple occasions, take the opportunity to do a brief screening to discern potential language difficulties. Next. Now, first, I have to ask, and again, we're not in person, so I can't tell, but oftentimes people are sort of, I think I caught you, because maybe you were looking at the top of that pyramid for where I was going to go next. And this is truly a new system. What we're talking about is use the understanding of what we see to inform everyone, to benefit everyone. So in this case, we use those results of the screening to enhance opportunities for frequent, positive, language-rich social interaction, language nutrition, and we continue to monitor engagement. And then if necessary, and this is just going to be so teeny tiny, if kids actually do need that individual response, you might get the kids who need it instead of too many to being sent out of the classroom. Another piece here that we have to talk about is when you separate children away from other children, again, we're talking about infants, toddlers, children, teens, that separating them away, they need more engagement, not less, in order to enhance their development. So if you make the assumption that they need individual therapy, that may actually not do you as well. We also want to consider that this exact same approach can be applied, can be done for all evaluations and reevaluations for those who have IEPs. So whether we're talking about an IFSP for little children, and we're talking about IEPs for children who are over age 3, the same approach can be done, and it's not an approach that's currently done. We also suggest applying the same approach for all children and teens involved or at risk for involvement with foster care or juvenile justice, because that can inform proactive guidance for caregivers, educators, healthcare providers, judges, and others. In fact, we are in the middle of doing a pilot on taking this approach in 3 communities in Georgia. Also, we can provide training to increase awareness and understanding of the relationship between language skills and mental health and well-being. We can also train mental health providers. So if somebody has a child referred to them, they can complete a brief language screening. That can be done as part of an initial assessment for all kids and teens. And that can be used to inform both the diagnostic process and, if there's something going on, the intervention considered. We also have the opportunity to conduct a review of existing policies, procedures, practices, programs, and services to identify and proactively include opportunities for abundant, positive, language-rich social interactions. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot. This recommendation is intended to address the gap between our knowledge of the impact of language skills and our practice and policies. I mean, I think you might be able to tell from this presentation, there's a bit of a chasm between our growing understanding of the impact of language skills and our existing practices and policies. Because is this the system we want to continue? Or is it time to create a new system that is solution-based? Solutions, not remedies. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. We have a question. I found myself trying to ask a question, and as I asked it, you answered it. So I was backing up. But this is a really good one. How much of this is given to early child care providers so we can begin intervention or prevention efforts as soon as possible, I wonder? And then they made a statement. We should also include caregivers, parents, so we can create a support system within the family and community.
Well, we're doing, thank you for the question. The important part of the answer is who is receiving the information and how are they utilizing the information. And we're encouraged because every time we do a presentation and do this presentation, which by the way, we update frequently based on research and based on feedback we receive. But every time we do the presentation, we receive invitations to do the presentation to other groups. And so we've spoken to teaching groups, we've spoken to school counselors and school psychologists, school social workers, we've spoken to case managers, we've spoken to juvenile court judges individually with their court staff. We've also spoken to the Council of Juvenile Court Judges. Many education professional associations and some other associations like DFACS that work with children. Not too long ago, we spoke to, help me Ariane, it was about 200 foster parents. And in fact, it's interesting, Sarah Lee, you'll appreciate this particularly, that probably the most enthusiastic response we've ever received was from foster parents. And the feedback was, as you were going through that, Ariane and Gary, our children kept coming up like, well, I see that. I see that in the children that I work with. I see that in my foster child. So we've done some follow-up with them as well. And also it's important, not just for foster parents, but for all parents. So we have done 2 presentations for the Georgia Parent Support Network. And I'm sure I'm leaving some groups out, Ariane. Also speech and language pathologists, we've talked to them as well. And that discussion was actually changing perhaps their role to be more influential in schools, not just work with students individually, but to work with parents. With parents and with teachers on understanding language and not just working with at the tier 3 level with students that are referred to them, but sharing their knowledge, which is a wealth of knowledge about language with teachers. And many times this is a companion presentation with Emily Rubin's social emotional engagement, knowledge and skills session, where you heard Ariane particularly talk about the importance of engagement. And that's what Emily Rubin's presentation and training focuses on. Engagement. It's a very powerful presentation.
Yeah, and for those who are talking, the question related to infants and toddlers, which I think also you had, Sarah Lee. So there is so much happening already in the work that DECAL is leading with the focus on early language and literacy. So much happening within systems that people can apply already when we're talking about infant and toddlers specifically. We're also working with neonatal intensive care units and birthing hospitals. And we are doing things like, we actually are doing training already now with nurses for those who work with pediatric and in a sort of prenatal, perinatal setting. I uploaded into the chat and these are draft. So, we don't care, go ahead and share it around, but they're called the Language and Missing Link and Missed Opportunity Toolkit. We're just doing a pilot on them now, I also uploaded the language skills by age band tool. Many of you know Emily Rubin, we worked on this as well. So Emily's been part of developing this whole approach. and implementing this approach as very simple tools. We also have some recent videos that feature how to use this information. And I want to make sure I get the other. Yeah, I think that's part of the question. Just wanted to add those things in there. And I see a lot of great presentations. Thank you so much. Yeah, so we hope you find that toolkit useful. And it goes across all the age bands. So my background is actually in prenatal and perinatal. So I'm actually very much an early person. My background is not as much in the later space, but it's such a great opportunity across. Other questions?
I don't see anything else. I agree. I think organizations like the Deal Center are doing a great job reaching out to educators and parents and caregivers and community and through schools and grants to try to get this information out. So I want to thank you and Dr. McGibney and for a wonderful presentation, and thank all of you for joining the session. We hope you found the information beneficial, and please enjoy the rest of the summit.